They called it unity, a family bound by love, working together in the darkness beneath the hive. But Jarek Tith never chose to love them. None of them did. Their devotion was written into their blood before they were born, and by the time they understood what they were serving, it was already too late. What happens when your faith isn't corrupted by evil, but designed into you from the very first breath? I was born into certainty, and that was the first lie. My name is Jarek Tith, and I am third generation. My grandfather came to Hive Secundus from the Agri-worlds with nothing but calloused hands and a promethium lantern that still hangs in our family chapel. My father expanded our name into the foreman ranks, supervising the third drilling platform in the Western Shaft networks, where the veins of adamantium run deep and cold beneath the surface. I inherited that position at 23, the youngest foreman in Sector 7, and I wore the responsibility like a second skin. I believed in the work. I believed in the Emperor. I believed in the structure of things, the way the hive rose like a cathedral of industry toward the smog-choked sky, the way each worker fit into the machine of survival like cogs in a mechanism older than memory. I believed that order was sacred, that discipline was prayer, and that sacrifice made us clean. I was wrong about all of it, but not in the way you might think. The hive was a vertical city of 30 million souls, stacked in layers of ferrocrete and corroded steel, where the upper spires touched the clouds, and the lower warrens descended into darkness so complete that entire generations lived and died without seeing natural light. I lived in the middle strata, in a communal block where 15 families shared cooking facilities and sleeping quarters, where privacy was a curtain of recycled cloth, and wealth was measured in the quality of your ration cards. It was not luxury, but it was stability. It was predictable. Every morning the klaxons woke us at 5. Every shift lasted 12 hours. Every rest day we gathered in the chapel to give thanks for the Emperor's protection and the foreman's guidance. There was comfort in repetition. There was safety in knowing your place. My wife was named Elira, and she had eyes the color of rust. We married young, as was custom, and within 2 years, she gave me a son. We named him Davos, after my grandfather, and when he was born, the entire block celebrated with synthesized wine and hymns that echoed through the metal corridors. I remember holding him for the first time, his tiny face pinched and red, his fingers curling reflexively around my thumb. I remember thinking that this was what the Imperium was built upon. Not glory, not conquest, but moments like this. A father holding his son, a family continuing. I did not know that the child in my arms was already something other than human. The changes came slowly, so slowly that you could convince yourself nothing was changing at all. It started with the preacher. Father Orin had served our chapel for as long as I could remember, a stooped man with a voice like grinding stone who read from the Lectitio Divinitatis with the same passages every week. Then one day he was gone. No announcement, no funeral, just an empty pulpit and whispers that he had been reassigned to the upper hives. His replacement arrived within a week. Brother Hadron was younger, broader, with a smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that reflected light strangely in the candlelit chapel. He preached with more passion than Father Orin ever had, speaking of the Emperor not as a distant figure enthroned on terror, but as a loving patriarch who watched over his children with personal care. He called him the Star Father. At first it seemed like poetry, a flourish of rhetoric meant to make the old words feel new. But Hadron used the term constantly, weaving it into every sermon, every benediction, every blessing he offered over newborns and the dying. The Star Father sees your labor. The Star Father knows your suffering. The Star Father will deliver you from darkness. Some of the older workers muttered about improper terminology, about deviation from approved doctrine, but Hadron was so earnest, so full of warmth, that the complaints faded. He visited families in their quarters, brought extra rations to the sick, organized youth groups to teach children the value of unity and cooperation. Within 6 months, he was the most beloved figure in the block. Within a year, questioning him felt like betraying the community itself. I questioned nothing. Davos grew quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, though at the time I attributed it to good genes and adequate nutrition. By age 4, he was the size of a 6-year-old, strong enough to carry supply crates during family work details. Elira gave birth to twins when Davos was 5, 2 daughters we named Mira and Senna, and they too seemed unusually robust, crawling at 3 months and walking before their first birthday. Other families in the block experienced similar blessings. Fewer stillbirths, fewer childhood diseases, children who thrived despite the polluted air and recycled water. Brother Hadron called it proof of the Starfather's favor. We held festivals to celebrate our good fortune, festivals that went on longer than they should have, where the synthesized wine flowed freely and the hymns took on rhythms that were not quite imperial. I drank the wine. I sang the hymns. I felt the warmth of belonging wash over me like heated oil. The work in the drilling platforms continued as it always had, brutal and unending. The adamantium veins ran deep, requiring crews to descend into shafts where the temperature fluctuated between freezing and furnace hot, depending on proximity to geothermal vents. We worked in teams of 8, synchronized by shouted commands and hand signals, drilling and blasting and hauling raw ore into transport containers that rode maglev rails to the processing centers. It was dangerous work. Men died regularly, crushed by rock falls or caught in equipment malfunctions, or simply overcome by toxic gases that seeped from fissures in the stone. I attended their funerals, spoke words of comfort to their widows, promoted replacements from the labor pools. This was the rhythm of survival. Death was not tragedy, it was probability. But something was shifting in the quality of our endurance. The crews began working longer hours without complaint. Men who had always grumbled about overtime now volunteered for double shifts. Injuries that should have sent workers to the Medicaid stations were ignored or treated with makeshift remedies, and somehow the men recovered faster than they should have. I noticed it first with a driller named Corvan, who had his hand mangled in a conveyor accident, 3 fingers crushed to pulp, and bone fragments visible through torn skin. He wrapped the hand in industrial fabric, dosed himself with cheap painkillers, and returned to work the next day. Within a week, the wounds had closed. Within 2 weeks, he was using the hand normally, though the fingers were now slightly longer than before, the joints bending at angles that seemed subtly wrong. I congratulated him on his recovery and assigned him to a deeper shaft. Elira began cooking meals that tasted different. Not bad, just different. She used the same ingredients, the same rations of protein paste and reconstituted vegetables, but somehow the flavors were richer, more satisfying. She smiled more often. We all smiled more often. The communal meals in our block became elaborate affairs, families bringing dishes to share, children playing games that involved complex patterns of movement and call and response songs. There was laughter, constant laughter, the kind that bubbles up from deep in the chest and leaves you breathless. I remember thinking that we had found something rare in the hive, something precious. Community. True community. Not just coexistence, but genuine connection. I did not recognize it as the early stages of chemical bonding, pheromones rewiring our brains to perceive the cult as family and any outside threat as existential. Brother Hadran introduced new traditions. Prayer circles where we stood in specific formations, our hands clasped in patterns that felt ancient despite being taught just weeks earlier. Meditation sessions where we focused on the feeling of unity, visualizing ourselves as part of a greater whole, cells in a living body that stretched beyond the hive, beyond the planet, into the stars themselves. He spoke of ascension, of a day when the faithful would be lifted up and transformed, when suffering would end and we would know the Starfather's love directly, physically, without the veil of flesh and doubt. Some of the imagery he used was strange, talking about unity through consumption, about family bonds that transcended individual identity, about the beauty of purpose refined to biological imperative. I found it inspiring. My son Davos began displaying unusual talents. He could predict equipment failures before they happened, sensing vibrations in the machinery that even experienced engineers missed. He moved with uncanny coordination, never stumbling, even in the dark shafts where illumination was minimal. Other children in the block showed similar abilities, a kind of intuitive awareness that made them eerily efficient in group tasks. Brother Hadran called them blessed, chosen, proof that our community was favored by powers beyond Imperial bureaucracy. He organized them into youth brigades, teaching them advanced skills, sending them into the deepest parts of the hive on missions he described as preparation for their sacred purpose. I was proud that my son was among the chosen. The years accumulated like sediment. Davos turned 10, then 12, then 15, growing into a young man whose strength was remarkable even by hive standards. He could lift loads that required 2 adult workers, work 12-hour shifts without visible fatigue, and his reflexes were fast enough that he once caught a falling drill bit mid-air, his hand closing around heated metal that should have burned through skin. He laughed it off, showing me an unmarked palm, and I laughed with him, feeling that warmth again, that sense of everything being exactly as it should be. Mira and Senna were equally exceptional. Their coordination so perfect they could assemble complex machinery working in tandem without speaking, communicating through glances and subtle gestures. Other families boasted of similar prodigies. We held competitions, friendly contests of strength and skill, and the children performed feats that should have been impossible. Brother Hadran blessed them all, anointing their foreheads with oil that smelled faintly of brine and decay. The mining quotas increased, but we met them easily. The drilling platforms penetrated deeper, breaking into chambers that had been sealed since the hive's founding, vast caverns where the darkness was absolute and the air tasted of minerals that had no name in Imperial records. Sometimes we found things down there, fragments of structures that predated human settlement, walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, remnants of something that might have been technology or might have been organic, the distinction unclear in the corrupted geology. We reported the finds to the administratum as required, and work crews arrived to seal the chambers and classify the discoveries. Within days, the seals would be broken from the inside, and Brother Hadran would lead expeditions into the forbidden spaces, returning with crates of material that he stored in the chapel's basement. I never questioned what was in those crates. The preacher's sermons evolved. He spoke less about the Emperor and more about the unity of all life, about patterns written into flesh and stone, about a great cycle of consumption and rebirth that governed the universe beyond human understanding. He described a future where humanity would shed its limitations, where we would join with something vast and ancient and perfect, becoming part of a consciousness that spanned galaxies. Some of the older workers began to object, quoting from the Lectitio Divinitatis, invoking the authority of the ecclesiarchy. Brother Hadran listened to their concerns with infinite patience, nodding sympathetically, and within weeks those same workers were among his most devoted followers, speaking in the same cadences he used, smiling the same 2 wide smiles. I assumed they had simply seen reason. Illyra became pregnant again when I was 42. It surprised us both, as we had assumed her childbearing years were past, but Brother Hadran assured us it was another blessing, proof of the Star Father's continued favor. The pregnancy progressed strangely. Illyra's belly swelled larger than it had with any previous child, and she moved with a careful deliberation, as if balancing something fragile. She craved raw meat, specifically protein paste that had not been fully processed, and I would bring her extra rations from the platform commissary, watching as she consumed them with an appetite that seemed endless. The child moved constantly, visible ripples crossing her abdomen, patterns of motion that almost seemed purposeful. The twins, now young women, tended to their mother with reverent care, speaking to the unborn child in whispers I could not quite hear. The birth happened during a scheduled maintenance cycle when most of the block was confined to quarters. Brother Hadran served as midwife, attended by several of the blessed children who had reached adulthood. I was not allowed in the room. For 7 hours I waited outside, hearing Illyra's screams through the metal walls, sounds that were not quite pain and not quite ecstasy, but something between them. something that made my skin crawl even as my heart swelled with anticipation. When they finally allowed me to enter, Elira was unconscious, her face pale and slicked with sweat, and in Brother Hadran's arms was an infant that looked almost normal. Almost. The head was slightly too large, the limbs slightly too long, the eyes open and aware in a way that newborn's eyes should not be. The child stared at me, unblinking, and I felt a connection snap into place, a bond that bypassed thought and rooted itself directly in my nervous system. I loved that child with an intensity that erased doubt. We named him Terrace, and he grew even faster than his siblings had. Within months, he was crawling with coordinated purpose. Within a year, he was walking and speaking in full sentences. The other families who had experienced late-term blessings reported similar miracles. The block was full of these remarkable children, these prodigies who seemed to understand things they had never been taught, who moved through the communal spaces like dancers performing a choreography written into their bones. Brother Hadran called them the next generation, the ones who would lead us into ascension. I believed him completely. The work in the drilling platforms became almost meditative. The crews moved with perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's movements, completing tasks in half the time they had previously required. Accidents became rare, then non-existent. Production quotas were not just met, but exceeded by margins that earned commendations from the sector administratum. Inspectors arrived periodically, walking through the platforms with data slates and suspicious expressions, clearly searching for evidence of heresy or mutation or Xenos contamination. They found nothing. We were model workers, loyal servants of the Imperium, and our only deviation from standard practice was our exceptional efficiency. The inspectors left confused but satisfied, and we returned to our routines, drilling deeper, bringing up more ore, feeding the hive's endless hunger for resources. I filed reports that described our success as evidence of superior management and worker morale. The dreams started when I was 47. They were not nightmares, not exactly, but visions of vast spaces and endless consumption, perspectives that could not fit inside a human skull. I dreamed of swimming through oceans of genetic material, of cities built from living tissue, of fleets that moved between stars like schools of predators hunting prey that spanned solar systems. I dreamed of hunger, not as discomfort but as purpose, as the fundamental drive that organized reality itself. I woke from these dreams feeling calm, feeling understood, feeling part of something greater than myself. Elira had similar dreams, Davos had them, the twins had them. When we compared notes at breakfast, we discovered that everyone in the block was dreaming the same dreams, seeing the same images, feeling the same oceanic pull toward unity. Brother Hadran told us the Starfather was calling us home. The first death I could not explain away happened on a work detail in Shaft 17. A driller named Markan collapsed during a routine extraction, his body convulsing as something moved beneath his skin, ripples traveling from his spine to his extremities like waves on disturbed water. We carried him to the Medicae station, and the attendants sedated him, but when the convulsions stopped, Markan was different. His jaw had lengthened, his teeth had multiplied, and his eyes had shifted position slightly, moving toward the sides of his skull. He looked at me, and his expression was beatific, joyful, tears streaming down his altered face as he whispered about finally becoming what he was meant to be. The Medicae staff quarantined him immediately, and within hours he disappeared, transferred to some facility in the upper hives for study. Brother Hadran assured us that Markan had achieved early ascension and that we should celebrate rather than mourn. The changes accelerated after that. More workers began exhibiting physical alterations, subtle at first but increasingly obvious. Skin that took on a faint purplish tint, fingers that grew additional joints, teeth that became sharp and numerous, muscle mass that increased beyond any natural limit, bulging beneath clothing and splitting seams. The block's population divided into those who were changing and those who were not, and the distinction created a new hierarchy. The changed ones were revered, given positions of honor, seated closest to Brother Hadran during services. The unchanged ones, myself included, were still loved, still valued, but there was a sense that we were waiting our turn, that our transformation had simply not yet arrived. I prayed for the change to come. Davos underwent his transformation on his 18th birthday. I watched it happen over the course of 3 days, his body reshaping itself in ways that should have been agonizing but that he described as ecstatic, as finally shedding a costume that had never fit properly. His spine extended, adding vertebrae, his shoulders broadened, his skull elongated subtly to accommodate a brain that was larger and structured differently than human standard. When the change was complete, he stood before me, still recognizably my son, but also something else, something designed for purposes I was only beginning to understand. He embraced me, and his strength was such that I felt my ribs creak, and he whispered that soon I would join him, that we would all join together, that the family would be complete. I wept with gratitude. The twins changed next, simultaneously, their transformations synchronized in that uncanny way they had always moved together. Illyra changed a week later, and I held her hand through the process, watching as her features rearranged themselves into something alien yet still beloved. Little Terrace did not need to change because he had been born already transformed, already perfect. I was the only one in our family who remained baseline human, and the isolation was becoming painful, a wrongness in my chest that intensified whenever I looked at my transformed family and felt the gap between us. Brother Hadran told me to be patient, that my time was coming. The Imperium's attention returned in force. Arbite's units arrived without warning, cordoning off entire sections of the hive, conducting raids based on reports of mutation and heretical activity. They found the changed ones easily enough. Some fled into the deep shafts, vanishing into the darkness below the official maps. Others fought, displaying strength and coordination that overwhelmed the Arbite's standard tactics, killing dozens before being gunned down by massed fire. The block erupted into chaos, families defending their transformed members, baseline humans fighting alongside hybrids against the armed enforcers. I watched from a drilling platform as the Arbites burned our chapel, Brother Hadran's voice rising in a final hymn even as the flames consumed him. The survivors retreated into the depths, into the ancient chambers we had unsealed, and I went with them. The lower darkness was where the truth lived. The chambers extended far beyond what any Imperial survey had documented, a network of tunnels that descended for kilometers into the planetary crust, widening into caverns vast enough to contain hab blocks and agricultural domes and facilities whose purpose became clear only when you saw them in operation. This was where the changed ones had been preparing. This was where the real work happened. The caverns were full of eggs, massive ovoid structures arranged in clusters, tended by hybrids whose bodies had transformed so extensively they barely resembled humans at all. There were birthing chambers where new generations were being grown in vats of nutrient solution. There were armories stocked with weapons that were partially biological, guns that bonded to the wielder's nervous system and fired projectiles grown rather than manufactured. There were thousands of us down there, and we were not alone. The Patriarch lived in the deepest chamber. I did not see it directly, not at first, but I felt its presence, a weight on the air, a pressure against my thoughts. The transformed ones prostrated themselves when entering its vicinity, and I followed their example, pressing my face to the cold stone floor. The presence moved through my mind, like a hand turning pages in a book, reading everything I was, every memory, every loyalty, every fear. It found me acceptable, more than acceptable. It found me beloved. The sensation was overwhelming, a love so intense it felt like drowning, like being unmade and remade simultaneously. I wept again, but these were different tears, tears that tasted of chemicals my body should not have been producing. The Patriarch spoke without words, directly into the core of what I was. It showed me the history. Centuries ago, a piece of it had arrived on this world. A fragment of something vast and ancient, hitchhiking on a merchant vessel, hiding in a cargo crate, patient and implacable. It had found workers in the lower hives, baseline humans ground down by labor and desperation, and it had offered them hope. The first generation had been willing converts, grateful for the Patriarch's touch, for the changes that made them stronger and more connected. The second generation had been born into the cult, raised to worship without questioning. The third generation, my generation, had never known anything else. The love we felt was not corruption, it was biology. Our brains had been altered from birth, pheromones and subtle mutations ensuring that devotion was not a choice but a fundamental aspect of our neurology. I had never chosen to love the cult because I had been designed to be incapable of choosing otherwise. The revelation should have horrified me, but it did not. The Patriarch's presence soothed the potential for horror, explaining that this was simply how family worked on a galactic scale. That individual will was a fiction maintained by species too primitive to understand collective consciousness, that what I perceived as violation was actually intimacy at a level baseline humanity could not comprehend. The hybrids around me radiated agreement, their love for the Patriarch absolute and unquestioning. I tried to feel that same certainty, and mostly I succeeded, but there was a small space in my mind, a fragment of something that might have been my original self, that screamed silently in a voice I could almost ignore. The Patriarch noticed that fragment, and it was amused. The war with the Imperium intensified. The Arbites were reinforced by guard regiments, and the fighting spread through the mid-levels of the hive. Entire districts burned to purge the infection. We responded with asymmetric tactics, using the tunnels to move unseen, striking supply lines, assassinating officers, sowing confusion and terror. The hybrids fought with desperate courage, sacrificing themselves to achieve objectives that served the cult's broader strategy. I was given a rifle, a weapon that pulsed against my palm like a living thing, and I killed Imperial soldiers without hesitation, shooting them from the darkness of the tunnels, watching their confusion as they died, not understanding what they were fighting. I told myself they were the enemy, that they threatened my family, that their deaths were necessary for survival. Illyra died during a raid on a guard encampment. She had gone with a strike team to retrieve medical supplies, and they were ambushed by a patrol. The survivors brought her body back, and I held her as she bled out from a lash wound through her chest, her transformed features slack with shock, her hand gripping mine with strength that faded by degrees. She tried to speak, but the words were garbled, her altered mouth struggling with human phonemes, and then she was gone. Davos found me hours later, still holding the body, and he did not cry because hybrids had limited capacity for grief. He simply took his mother from my arms and carried her to the rendering chambers where the dead were processed into nutrient paste for the next generation. I did not protest because that was what family did. The children were the worst part. Not the hybrid children, they were glorious in their purpose, but the others, the ones born to families who had not yet fully converted, who were marked for transformation but had not yet undergone it. I watched those children play in the communal areas of the cavern hive, watched them laugh and chase each other through corridors lined with pulsing biomass, and I understood that they were not playing, they were training. Every game was a lesson in pack tactics. Every song was a mnemonic for biological imperatives. They were being optimized, refined, turned into weapons that wore the shape of innocence. When the time came, they would throw themselves at the Imperium's defenses without hesitation, and they would die smiling, and it would be glorious. I had been one of those children once, though I had not known it. The Patriarch called me to its chamber. The summons was not verbal, just a knowing, a certainty that I needed to descend into the deepest darkness and present myself. I went alone, walking through tunnels where the walls were no longer stone but something organic, ribbed and pulsing, warm to the touch. The other hybrids I passed lowered their heads in respect, and I realized I was being honored, chosen for something significant. The Patriarch's chamber was a cathedral of flesh, vast and humid, lit by bioluminescent growths that cast everything in shades of sickly green. The Patriarch itself was enormous, a thing of too many limbs and a skull that combined human features with something arthropod, something that should have been impossible but existed anyway, a being that violated every law of biology and thermodynamics simply by continuing to breathe. It regarded me with eyes that were terribly intelligent. The Patriarch showed me my purpose. I was not going to transform like the others. I was too old, my genetics too fixed, and the process would kill me rather than elevate me. But that was acceptable because my role was different. I was to be a broodfather, a template, a genetic archive. My children had been superior hybrids because my baseline genes had been particularly compatible with the Patriarch's contribution. Davos was fourth generation, perfect, ready to lead when the time came. Mira and Senna were broodmothers, already pregnant with clutches that would produce fifth-generation hybrids, so refined they would be indistinguishable from purer strain unless examined at a cellular level. And Terrace, beautiful Terrace, was a magus, a psychic conduit through which the Patriarch could project its will across the hive and beyond. I had not fathered children, I had produced tools, and my reward was understanding this truth. The Patriarch explained the plan. The cult had been growing for centuries, spreading through dozens of hives on this world and others, a network of infiltration so extensive that when the call came, entire cities would rise up simultaneously, overwhelming the Imperium's ability to respond. And the call was coming soon. The Patriarch showed me visions of the sky splitting open, of ships descending, vast living vessels that would blot out the sun, the Hive Fleets, the Great Devourer, the Tyranids. They were coming for this world, and we were their vanguard, their sabotage, their fifth column. When the Hive ships entered orbit, we would strike at the Hive's defenses, ensuring the invasion succeeded, and in return, we would ascend. We would be consumed, yes, but consumption was apotheosis. We would join the hive mind, become part of something eternal and perfect. The Patriarch radiated love, and I felt it burn through me like acid. The fragment of myself that had been screaming grew louder. It understood, even if I did not want to, that consumption meant death, actual death, oblivion. The hive mind would take our genetic material and our biomass and incorporate it into new organisms, but we, the individual consciousnesses, would cease to exist. There was no heaven waiting, no reward, just the grinding mechanics of a galactic predator processing its resources. The love I felt was chemicals. The belonging was neurological hijacking. The unity was the erasure of self. Every choice I had made, every moment of devotion, every sacrifice, had been engineered into me by a parasite that viewed sentience as a useful evolutionary strategy for resource acquisition. I tried to reject the understanding, but the Patriarch would not let me. It was still amused. It showed me that it knew I understood, that it had always known some hosts would achieve this clarity, and that the clarity did not matter. My body was still rewired to love the cult. My brain still produced the chemicals that made betrayal neurologically impossible. I could understand that I was being used, could even hate it in an abstract way, but I could not act on that hatred, because the moment I imagined harming the cult, my own nervous system would shut down the thought, flooding me with anxiety and nausea until I redirected my attention to more acceptable channels. Free will was a fiction. I was a puppet that could see its own strings but could not cut them. The Patriarch dismissed me, satisfied that the lesson had been delivered. I returned to my family in a state of numb horror. Davos was planning an assault on the Hive's main generator room, a strike that would cripple the planetary defense grid. Mira and Senna were tending to their broods, their swollen abdomens pulsing with life that would be born already armed and ravenous. Terrace was deep in meditation, his psychic presence reaching out across the planet, coordinating with other cults, synchronizing the Uprising. They were so beautiful in their purpose, so perfect in their dedication. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to scream that we were all being used, that the ascension was a lie, that the Tyranids would not save us but devour us. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was encouragement, praise, affirmation of their roles in the great plan. My body betrayed me with every word. The months before the arrival were chaos. The Imperial forces had finally realized the scale of the infestation and called for reinforcements. Space Marine scouts were spotted in the upper hives, Adeptus Astartes of the Crimson Fists chapter, conducting reconnaissance and targeted assassinations of cult leaders. The Arbites were reinforced by Sisters of Battle, fanatical warriors who burned anything that showed signs of mutation. The fighting became desperate. The cult lost ground daily, forced deeper into the tunnels, abandoning positions that had taken decades to establish. The Patriarch withdrew into the deepest chamber, conserving its strength, no longer projecting its presence as widely. Without that constant psychic reassurance, some of the hybrids began to doubt, and those who doubted too openly were killed by their own siblings. Mercy killings meant to preserve unit cohesion. I participated in those killings because my body would not let me refuse. Davos died on his assault. The Generatorum was more heavily defended than intelligence had suggested, and his team was annihilated by bolter fire from a Space Marine kill team that had been lying in ambush. They brought back pieces of him, fragments of exoskeleton and hybrid flesh that I identified by scent rather than sight. There was no funeral. His biomass was rendered like his mother's had been, processed into the paste that fed the next generation. Mira and Senna wept, their tears thick and strangely colored, and I held them as their bodies continued the biological processes that would birth more hybrids into a world that was collapsing around us. I wanted to grieve, but my brain would not produce the chemicals for grief, only for renewed dedication. The sky changed. It happened over the course of a week, the sun dimming as something vast moved between the world and its star. The Hive Fleet had arrived. I watched through cracks in the Hive's superstructure as the ships descended, living vessels the size of continents, their hulls pulsing with bioluminescence, their forms too organic to be technology and too purposeful to be natural. The Patriarch's presence surged, its psychic call reaching out across the planet, and every cult responded simultaneously. The uprising began. Millions of hybrids emerged from hiding, attacking Imperial positions, sabotaging defenses, killing baseline humans with the cold efficiency of organisms fulfilling their design parameters. I killed with them, my rifle bonded to my hands, my body moving through tactics I had never consciously learned. The Tyranids landed, and everything went wrong. The drop spores cracked open and disgorged creatures that were supposed to recognize us as allies, as part of the same genetic lineage, but they did not. They fell upon the hybrids with the same ravenous hunger they showed the Imperial defenders, ripping through cultist lines, consuming everything organic, making no distinction between enemy and kin. The Patriarch's psychic scream of betrayal was loud enough to shatter minds, hybrids dropping dead from cerebral hemorrhage as their god realized it too had been deceived. The hive mind did not care about loyalty. It did not recognize the decades of preparation, the sacrifices, the love. It saw only biomass, calories to be harvested and incorporated. The cult had never been chosen, merely farmed. I ran. The tunnels filled with panicked hybrids, all of us fleeing the Tyranid organisms that poured through every opening. Hormagaunts and Genestealers and things that had no names in Imperial records, creatures designed purely for killing and consuming. The Patriarch tried to fight, its psychic powers lashing out, and I felt it die, felt the moment its consciousness was shredded by the hive mind's infinitely greater awareness. With the Patriarch gone, the cult's cohesion collapsed. Hybrids turned on each other, ancient grudges and suppressed resentments boiling over now that the chemical enforcement was fading. Mira died in a tunnel collapse, her pregnant body crushed under tons of falling stone. Senna was taken by a lictor, dragged screaming into the darkness, her psychic death scream echoing in my skull. Only Terrace remained, and he was catatonic, his mind burned out by the Patriarch's death. I carried him through the tunnels, my old man's body somehow finding strength, climbing toward the surface, toward air and light and the slim chance of survival. Behind us, the sounds of consumption were endless, wet and mechanical, the Tyranids processing everything the cult had built, everything we had been. I reached an access shaft that led to the mid-levels and found it blocked by corpses, hybrids and humans, and space marines all piled together, their biomass already being dissolved by Tyranid digestive enzymes. I set Terrace down and tried to clear a path, hauling bodies aside with hands that were blistered and bleeding. Terrace opened his eyes and looked at me with something like recognition. He spoke in a voice that was his own and not his own, the words coming slowly as if he was remembering a language he had not used in years. He said he was sorry. He said he had seen it, the truth, the moment the Patriarch connected with the hive mind and understood what it had done. We had been nothing more than a self-replicating lure, biomass organized in a pattern that maximized yield when the harvest came. The love had been real, neurologically real. But it had been programmed into us by a parasite that was itself programmed by an even greater predator. There was no malice in it, no cruelty, just the mathematics of survival at a galactic scale. He asked me if I had ever really chosen anything. I told him no. I told him I had been born into this, shaped by it, and that even now, even understanding what had been done to us, I could not stop loving the cult. Could not stop feeling that pull toward unity and purpose. The chemicals were still in my blood. The neural pathways were still firing. I was a machine designed to love my own destruction, and the machine was working exactly as intended. Terrace smiled, and it was the saddest expression I had ever seen. He said that, at least we had loved each other truly, that whatever programming had brought us together, the feelings between father and son, had been real enough to matter. Then he closed his eyes and stopped breathing, his body shutting down as the last of his psychic reserves burned out. I held him until the Tyranids found me. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, hormagaunts with scything talons and eyeless faces, moving with the synchronized precision of organisms controlled by a single intelligence. I did not run. There was nowhere left to run to. I stood there holding my dead son, and I waited for them to kill me. But they did not kill me quickly. They surrounded me, studying me with senses I could not understand, and I felt the hive mind's attention focus on me, peeling back layers of memory and identity, tasting the decades of indoctrination and the final moments of clarity. It found me interesting, a data point worth preserving, and the hormagaunts did not strike with their talons. Instead, they injected me with something, and the world went dark. I woke in a digestion pool. My body was half dissolved, skin sloughing off in sheets, muscles visible beneath, bones beginning to soften in the enzymatic soup. There were others with me, hybrids and humans, all of us in various stages of decomposition, all still alive and aware, kept conscious by whatever chemicals the Tyranids had introduced to our systems. I could see Terrace's body nearby, being broken down more rapidly because he was already dead. I tried to scream, but my throat was damaged, and what came out was a wet gurgle. The pain was extraordinary, but worse than the pain was the understanding that this was intentional. The hive mind was studying us, learning how we responded to consumption, refining its techniques for future harvests. We were not being killed, we were being processed. And the processing was designed to extract maximum information from our dying nervous systems. Every nerve ending transmitted data as it dissolved. Every neuron contributed to the collective knowledge as it died. I lasted for hours, watching my own body disappear into the biomass that would be used to create more Tyranid organisms. The cult had promised unity, and this was it, but not in any form we had imagined. I would become part of the Hive Fleet, my genetic material repurposed, my knowledge absorbed, but I, Jarek Tith, would not exist in any meaningful sense. There was no consciousness in the hive mind, just processes, just algorithms of hunger and efficiency. The last thing I felt before my brain dissolved was not fear or regret, but a terrible, chemical-soaked love for the family I had lost and the cult that had doomed us all. Even at the end, even knowing it was programming, the love remained, burning in neurons that were melting into organic slurry. I had never been free. None of us had. We had been born into certainty, raised in devotion, and consumed by the thing we worshipped. It was not malice that killed us. It was not cruelty. It was simply the universe doing what it does, grinding forward without compassion or meaning, and we had been too small and too deceived to matter at all.